Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Glad to be here.
Imagine sliding a convicted serial killer into an MRI machine, pressing a button, and just seeing the exact biological coordinate of evil light up on a glowing screen.
Right. It's a wild thought.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, if human morality is just this biological evolutionary trait, what happens to the concept of the human soul? And why do traditional religions view Satan as the ultimate cosmic villain, while modern Satanists argue he was actually the original champion of human rights?
Yeah, it's a huge contrast.
Exactly. So is our sense of right and wrong handed down by a divine creator, or is it just a complex psychological trick to keep us from, destroying each other?
Well, these are really the massive tectonic plates of human philosophy just colliding, right?
Yeah.
We are looking at human nature through fundamentally opposed lenses today. We've got theology, evolutionary psychology, and hard neuroscience.
And the friction between them is intense.
Whoa, absolutely. It creates some deeply uncomfortable questions about who we actually are.
For sure. So we are exploring two incredible sources today to try and make sense of this. First, we've got a really tense but remarkably candid roundtable debate hosted by Jubilee.
That one is fascinating.
It is. It brings devoted followers of major world religions, so Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, face-to-face with modern Satanists to debate the nature of morality.
It's quite the room.
Yeah, talk about a heavy guest list. And paired with that, we're tracking a global documentary journey that really digs into the historical, psychological, and, well, the neurological roots of human evil.
Right.
Just a quick note for you listening. We are navigating some deep religious and philosophical waters today.
Very deep.
Yeah. So, as always, we aren't here to take sides or endorse any specific worldview, whether you're left-wing, right-wing, religious, atheist. We are simply impartial guides. We're just exploring the ideas contained in these sources to see what they reveal about the human condition.
Exactly. Our core mission in this deep dive is to uncover the underlying mechanics of belief.
Right, like how it all works under the hood.
Yeah. Yeah. We are not just looking at what people think about good and evil, but, why human brains are wired to create these moral frameworks in the first place.
And how those frameworks physically shape our societies. Oh, and hey, real quick, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
Absolutely.
So, to understand evil, I think we first have to understand what humans think they are actually supposed to be doing with their time on Earth.
Right, the big why are we here question.
Yeah, we have to look at the cosmic clash over life's purpose. In the roundtable source, the religious perspective, which is voiced pretty heavily by a Christian pastor and a Muslim participant, they argue that faith provides a higher purpose.
And honestly, they make a very compelling case for why that matters.
They really do. I mean, they point out that when the world devolves into chaos, like, say, during a global pandemic.
Right, which we all remember.
Exactly. Having a higher purpose acts as a unifying force. It provides this profound psychological comfort.
Yeah, you can really think of it as a psychological safety net.
A safety net.
Yeah. From their perspective, a higher purpose is an anchor in a totally unpredictable universe. It's this deeply held belief that our actions echo in eternity, and that we are participating in a grander divine design.
Which is comforting.
Very. And that shared narrative binds humanity together under a single moral canopy. Historically, that's been crucial for large-scale human survival.
But the Satanists and the atheists sitting across the table, they completely reject that framing.
Oh, totally.
To them, the phrase higher purpose isn't a safety net at all. They see it as a cage.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, one of them points out that a top-down purpose feels inherently oppressive. It's like some unseen authority is pointing a finger at you and saying, God chose you to do this one specific thing, and if you deviate, well, you're flawed.
Right. So instead of looking up for a purpose, they advocate looking inward.
Yes, they argue for self-preservation, absolute personal responsibility, and, practical empathy.
The argument there is that if individuals simply take proper care of themselves and their immediate communities, society won't suddenly just devolve into anarchy.
Right. It is a fundamental disagreement on the definition of morality in action.
It really is. The religious side views morality as adherence to an external divine standard,
while the atheistic humanist side views it as a continuous series of micro-actions.
Yeah.
Rooted entirely in practical reality and cause and effect.
Exactly. And that clash over practical reality brings up a highly relatable anecdote from the debate.
Oh, the toilet paper thing.
Yes! The great toilet paper hoarding of the pandemic.
That was wild. So One participant mentions watching a guy just clear the shelves, buy 10 packs of toilet paper while everyone else went without, and he labels that act as wrong.
But the question is the hoarder evil?
Right. Or is his brain just ruthlessly executing that atheist ideal of self-preservation?
It's a tough question. It really highlights how incredibly relative morality becomes the second our survival instincts kick in.
Absolutely.
The thing is, both sides of this debate actually want the exact same outcome.
They do.
Yeah. They both want a flourishing, balanced, and safe society where people don't hoard resources to the detriment of others.
Okay, right.
The friction is entirely about the mechanism of authority. Like, does the authority that compels you to be a good person have to come from above, or can it be generated from within the individual?
I like to think of it as an analogy. It's like comparing the traditional religious view of purpose to being handed a pre-written script for a play.
Oh, I like that.
Right. You have a role, you have lines, and there's a director in charge of the whole production.
And the atheist or Satanist view is pure improv.
Pure improv. You're making it up as you go, reacting in real time to the people on stage with you. So the ultimate question for you as the listener is the psychological comfort of having a script worth the loss of authoring your own life?
That is the core tension right there. And because these groups fundamentally disagree on who writes the rules of morality, it makes perfect sense that they also completely disagree on the ultimate villain who breaks those rules.
Oh, man. Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's reevaluate Satan.
Let's do it.
If you grew up in a traditional Abrahamic faith, the definition of Satan is pretty static.
Very.
To the Christian pastor at the roundtable, Satan is a literal central figure of evil. He's the supernatural adversary of a good and loving God.
But the Satanists in this discussion don't see him that way at all.
Not even a little bit.
No. In fact, modern Satanists, like those associated with the Satanic Temple, they generally do not believe in a literal supernatural devil.
Right. They identify as atheistic humanists and skeptics.
Exactly. For them, Satan is strictly a literary symbol.
And what a symbol it is. I mean, they view him as the ultimate icon of freedom, liberty, and this thirst for knowledge.
Yeah, they look at the Genesis story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and just completely invert the moral of the story.
It's wild to hear. One of the Satanists argues that God wanted to keep humans naked and stupid as these simple, obedient playthings.
Right, so in their interpretation, Satan, the serpent, offering the fruit from the tree of knowledge, he was actually the first advocate for equal rights.
Wow, it's just a profound paradigm shift. They are taking the oldest story of human disobedience and framing rebellion against tyrannical authority as a strict moral good.
It really flips everything upside down. And then we get a completely different third perspective from the Hindu participant.
Right, I almost forgot about that.
Yeah, in Hinduism, the concept of a singular, ultimate evil entity doesn't really exist in the same binary way.
Okay, so how do they see it?
The closest parallel is viewed more as an assistant to God. It's a force that causes necessary disruptions and challenges, which ultimately forces the spiritual growth of humanity.
So we have Satan as the ultimate evil, Satan as the ultimate freedom fighter, and Satan as a divine disruptor.
Exactly. Three totally different views.
But the deepest, most irreconcilable clash in that room happens over the concept of original sin.
Oh yeah, that got intense.
Yeah. The Christian pastor, Reverend Kudakala, talks about the inherent human bend toward violence and selfishness that has been passed down through generations.
The idea that we are born broken.
Right. Because of this inherent flaw, he argues humanity fundamentally requires a savior. He brings up the traditional belief of Jesus taking on the penalty for human sin, stating that God gave up his son at a very high price.
And the response to that premise is where the conversation almost completely breaks down.
Oh, totally. The Satanist immediately pushes back and says, a high price. He gave up a weekend.
Ouch.
Yeah. Meaning, if Jesus is an immortal God who came back to life a few days later, where is the ultimate sacrifice?
It's a really sharp critique.
You can visibly see the two groups speaking completely past each other at that point. Like they aren't even having the same conversation. What is the underlying mechanism causing this total communication breakdown?
Well, I mean, it comes down to how narratives demand specific solutions.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
The Christian narrative of original sin is built on the premise that humans are inherently broken on a spiritual level.
Right.
If you are born spiritually bankrupt, that necessitates a divine savior and the concept of grace, because the debt of sin is just too large for a human to pay.
That makes sense within that framework.
But the Satanist narrative rejects the idea of inherent spiritual brokenness entirely. They view humans simply as animals.
Highly evolved animals, but animals nonetheless.
Exactly. And animals must take absolute responsibility for their own minute-by-minute actions. To a Satanist, relying on a divine savior to just wash away your mistakes is an abdication of personal accountability.
That's fascinating. Think about how we judge people today on social media, you know?
Oh, right. Cancel culture.
Yeah. When someone makes a terrible public mistake, the internet often treats them as fundamentally, permanently tainted. It's almost like a modern, secular version of original sin that demands public exile.
That's a really good point.
Or, on the flip side, do we view them as an animal who made a bad choice in that exact second, capable of immediate course correction?
Right.
If we don't agree on whether humans are inherently flawed, it raises the next big question. What actually stops us from doing evil?
Right. Is it the fear of divine punishment, or is it just a psychological trick?
Exactly. And this brings us to the actual mechanics of morality, specifically the theological debate on hell.
Yeah, that's a big one.
In the roundtable, the Satanist makes a really sharp moral argument against the concept of hell.
They state that a God who would burn people in an eternal lake of fire simply for non-belief.
Right, especially when an all-knowing God would know exactly what standard of evidence it would take to convince an atheist.
Exactly. They argue that kind of God is cruel, inhumane, and completely unworthy of worship.
But the pastor counters that by emphasizing the generosity of grace.
Yeah, from his theological framework, God offers a perfect free gift of salvation.
And if a person actively exercises their free will to reject that grace, the necessary outcome of a perfectly just universe is judgment.
Because you cannot have justice without consequence.
Right. But this idea of unseen cosmic consequence isn't a modern invention at all.
No, not even close.
The documentary source takes us way back, like back to the 3,500-year-old Egyptian tomb of Mina in Luxor.
That part was visually stunning.
It really was. Carved into the stone is one of the oldest depictions of moral consequence in human history, the weighing of the heart.
Oh, yeah.
If your heart is heavy with bad deeds, lying or stealing, it outweighs the feather of truth and you are denied entry to the afterlife.
That Egyptian concept establishes a fundamental psychological mechanism that predates modern Abrahamic religions by a lot.
Yeah.
It formalizes the idea that our hidden bad actions carry a permanent weight that will eventually be evaluated by an unseen judge.
An unseen judge. And evolutionary psychology tells us exactly why early human societies needed this mechanism to survive.
Right. Which brings us to psychologist Jesse Baring's Princess Alice experiment.
I love this experiment. It is absolutely fascinating.
It really is. So, researchers put children in a room and tell them to throw sticky balls at a target. But, and here's the catch, they have to do it with their backs turned.
Right. And when the kids are left alone in the room, they almost immediately cheat to win a prize.
Of course they do.
They step over the line, they peek, they move the balls.
Which is entirely predictable. I mean, the human animal, when unobserved, will often bend the rules to maximize its own reward.
But then, the researchers run the experiment again. This time, they point to an empty chair in the corner of the room and tell the kids that an invisible, magical entity named Princess Alice is sitting there watching them.
And suddenly, the kids stop cheating.
It's amazing. One little girl even cautiously reaches out to feel the empty space above the chair, just to check.
It's so telling.
So I want to ask you, the listener, right now, would you rob a bank if you knew with 100% certainty you wouldn't get caught?
That is the ultimate question.
Right. If there were no cameras, no guards, no societal consequences whatsoever.
It's the ultimate ethical litmus test. And the reason the Princess Alice experiment works is due to something called hyperactive agency detection.
Hyperactive agency detection. What is that exactly?
Well, human brains evolved to detect unseen agents. If our ancestors heard a rustle in the bushes, the ones who assumed it was an unseen predator, an agent, they ran away and survived.
Okay.
The ones who assumed it was just the wind, well, they often got eaten.
Right, naturally.
So we are hardwired to feel like we are being watched.
Which makes you wonder, did humanity essentially invent the concept of an all-seeing God, a divine watcher, just to act as our own cultural Princess Alice?
It's a very strong theory in evolutionary psychology.
Yeah. The weighing of the heart in ancient Egypt and the empty chair in that modern laboratory, they demonstrate the exact same psychological principle.
That large-scale human cooperation requires the perception of surveillance. It curbs our selfish impulses.
Exactly. Whether that surveillance is a literal deity, the concept of karma, or an invisible magical princess, the human brain alters its behavior when it feels it is being observed.
But relying on the fear of an invisible watcher, whether that's a literal god or a magical princess, it assumes something critical.
What's that?
It assumes that our brains are fully capable of understanding consequence and actually making a choice.
Oh, wow.
What happens if the physical machinery we use to make moral choices is literally broken?
That is terrifying. And it pushes us past psychology and straight into hard neuroscience.
Yes, it does.
So, the documentary introduces us to Dr. Kiehl, a neuroscientist who has spent his career scanning the brains of hundreds of psychopathic criminals.
His work is groundbreaking.
He really is. He meets with a man in a maximum security prison. This guy is a serial rapist and killer who ranks in the 99th percentile of psychopaths.
The worst of the worst.
Exactly. When asked why he committed his crimes, the man basically shrugs and says, "I had an impulse and I couldn't stop myself. I don't feel remorse." And then Dr. Kiehl looks at this man's MRI scan, and it physically looks different than a normal brain.
Specifically, he points to a severely underdeveloped orbital frontal cortex.
Okay, break that down for us.
Think of the brain like a corporate boardroom.
Okay.
The primitive reptilian parts of the brain are constantly shouting out terrible, selfish, impulsive ideas.
Right, do this, take that.
Exactly. Now, a healthy orbital frontal cortex acts as the boardroom's veto button. It evaluates those impulses, realizes they will cause harm or societal rejection, and hits the veto button.
It stops you.
Right. But in a severe psychopath, that veto button physically does not exist, or it's severely atrophied.
That is staggering. And Dr. Kiehl is now trying to use this MRI technology to scan the brains of kids as young as 10 to 12 years old.
Which is controversial, but you can see why he's doing it.
Yeah, he's hoping to identify this specific biological atrophy early to intervene before they turn to violence.
Right.
So I have to throw a really tough philosophical pushback at you here.
Bring it on.
If Dr. Kiehl is right, if the most horrific evil is quite literally just an underdeveloped orbital frontal cortex, then a psychopathic killer isn't a spiritual demon.
No.
They're essentially a biological machine with a broken brake pedal.
That's an uncomfortable truth.
If you don't have the physical hardware to stop an impulse, how does that impact our entire concept of justice, sin, and karma?
Well, it creates a massive crisis in a field known as neurolaw.
Neurolaw.
Yeah, it examines how discoveries in neuroscience should impact our legal system. I mean, if our choices are strictly dictated by brain density and neural wiring, the concept of moral culpability begins to dissolve.
Right, you wouldn't punish a car for having cut brake lines, so how do you punish a human for having an atrophied cortex?
Exactly. It makes the religious concept of inherent sin look almost scientifically prophetic, just, using different vocabulary.
That is a wild connection, but it's remarkable how different ancient traditions attempt to manage this internal reality of a broken brain.
It really is.
Take Zoroastrianism, for example. It's one of the world's oldest religions. Modern Zoroastrians don't believe in a literal supernatural devil flying around causing mischief.
Right. They view evil purely as an internal combatant in the mind.
Yes, the battle against that internal brokenness is fought daily through a strict regimen of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds.
It is basically an ancient framework for cognitive behavioral therapy.
I never thought of it like that, but you're right. And we see another approach to containing this internal darkness in Varanasi, India.
Oh, the documentary segment there was amazing.
It shows Hindu practitioners dealing with what they view as unhappy ancestral spirits like ghosts causing sickness and bad luck.
But they don't perform an aggressive exorcism to destroy the evil.
No, they feed the spirit, they offer it a meal, an umbrella, shoes. They treat the evil with deep respect so that it can find peace and move on.
It's all about management and transformation.
Exactly. Whether you are a neuroscientist looking at an MRI, a Zoroastrian managing your daily thoughts, or a Hindu practitioner feeding an unquiet spirit, the underlying mechanism is identical.
We are all trying to contain and transform the darkness inside us.
Which brings us to the human capacity for change, and specifically the story of Brian Widner.
That story is heavy.
It is. Brian was a former neo-Nazi skinhead enforcer for 16 years. He described himself as having a hole in his soul, and his only driving goal was to destroy the world.
He was, by his own admission, an evil person spreading tangible harm.
But then two things happened. He met a woman, they had a son, and he experienced what he describes as finding a godly presence.
Right. The responsibility of bringing new life into the world forced him to confront the darkness inside him.
But the internal psychological change wasn't enough for him, because his face and neck were completely covered in violent racist tattoos.
Yeah, to physically erase his past, he underwent 25 excruciating laser tattoo removal
I'll
sessions.
take 25 sessions.
I struggled to wrap my head around that detail initially. It's one thing to regret your past, but to undergo 2.5 years of facial laser surgery, leaving your face looking completely battered, that goes way beyond regret.
He viewed that intense physical pain as a necessary penance. He needed the physical pain to map onto his moral guilt, to feel clean again.
It is a profound narrative of redemption.
It really is.
It tells us that even if evil is linked to an underdeveloped frontal cortex or some deep spiritual darkness, human beings possess a staggering amount of neuroplasticity.
We aren't entirely fixed.
Right. We have an incredible biological and psychological capacity to rewrite our own neural pathways and our spiritual destinies.
Brian's story proves that the broken brake pedal can sometimes be painstakingly repaired.
Absolutely.
So what does this all mean? We have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We've gone from atheistic Satanists arguing biblical semantics with Christian pastors over the true meaning of the Garden of Eden,
To the realization that we might just be kids tricked into good behavior by an invisible Princess Alice.
Right. We've weighed ancient Egyptian hearts, and we've analyzed the literal MRI scans of psychopathic minds.
And through it all, we've seen that whether humanity looks to the heavens for a pre-written moral script or looks inward to improvise our survival, the struggle against the dark parts of our nature is the defining feature of the human experience.
It is. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Okay.
We talked about Dr. Kiehl trying to spot the biological markers of evil in kids. Imagine a future, maybe not that far off, where science perfectly maps every single moral choice we make down to firing neurons and brain density.
That's a wild thought.
What if we eventually learn to cure evil? Like, what if we invent a pill or a targeted gene therapy that physically repairs the orbital frontal cortex and completely removes a person's capacity to cause harm?
Wow. Well, I mean, if you completely remove the biological capacity for evil, what happens to free will?
Exactly. If a person is biologically forced to be peaceful, does their choice to be good actually mean anything anymore?
Probably not.
If you surgically remove the capacity for evil, the moral script is just hardwired into our biology. We aren't actors or improvisers anymore, we're just machines.
That is a lot to think about.
It is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the scripts you're handed and keep exploring the world around you.
Until next time, keep thinking deeper.